Good evening. I'm Carter Hudgens, the President and CEO, and on behalf of the Board of the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust and our talented staff, welcome you. It's hard to believe that this is the final program in this season's Distinguished Speaker Series. It's also hard to believe that this is the third run of the Distinguished Speaker Series. And I hope you all agree it's been quite a success. Thinking back on this year's events, we've covered everything from cannibalism to now culinary history tonight with Dr. Shields. Before introducing Dr. David Shields, a couple of things I'd like to point out, and this is all in prep for next season's Distinguished Speaker Series. Stay tuned to our website as well as our other communications materials as the list of speakers will be announced before the end of the year. Tara tells me sometime in November, so stay tuned. That'll be on your computer and in your inbox very soon. Another change, or a change that we're going to make, though, beginning next season, we're going to move this program up to the Charleston Museum. So we look forward to seeing you there in that location. The details will be on the website. We're also going to change the date. So rather than the third Thursday of every month, we're going to move to Tuesday nights. So just wanted to prep you with that bit of information, and further details will be announced in the near future. Also want to thank the Friends of Drayton Hall. Your loyal support makes this type of program possible. And if you are not a friend, I encourage you to join the Friends of Drayton Hall. I'm happy to chat with you, as are our other staff, Tara, Allison, and others. Now, Dr. David Shields, our speaker this evening, is the Carolina Distinguished Professor and McClintock Professor of Southern Letters in the College of Arts and Science at the University of South Carolina. His scholarship explores three fields: early American literary culture, American performing arts photography, and food studies, which we'll hear about this evening. He edited the Journal of Early American Literature for a decade, collaborated in writing a history of the book in early America, and the Cambridge History of American Literature, and also compiled the anthology of colonial verse, American Poetry, the 17th and 18th centuries, for the Library of America. His monographs, Oracles of Empire and Civil Tongues, and Polite Letters in British America, are central works in early American studies. Shields owns one of the premier collections of stage and cinema still photographs, in private hands. His website in this endeavor, Broadway Photographs, is the standard reference for the visual culture of the American stage from the Civil War through the 20th century. His book, Still, American Silent Motion Picture Photography, won the American Popular Culture Association's Ray Brown Award for the best single work on American popular culture in 2013. Shields is currently the chairman of the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, the nonprofit group whose mission is to preserve and restore the agriculture and cultivars of the American South. He and collaborators Glenn Roberts, Brian Ward, and Sean Brock have brought back into cultivation and culinary use such ingredients as Carolina Gold Rice, Sea Island White Flint Corn, the Carolina African Peanut, the Sea Island Red Pea, Benny, the Rice Pea, Inyama Sorghum, and the Bradford Watermelon. His most recent book, Southern Provisions on the Creation and Revival of Cuisine, will soon be followed by a collection of 200 biographies entitled Culinarians, American Chefs, Caterers, and Restaurateurs, 1793 to 1919. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Shields.
I'm so glad to be here. When I lived in Charleston with my wife Lucy, who's here tonight, going out to Drayton Hall was always such a treat to see the unvarnished, pure architecture, the spaces of that 18th century world. and to be able to speak to the people who are its most avid supporters gives me a certain joy in my heart. Tonight, I'm talking about one area of the research that we did that enabled us to engage in such extraordinary restorations of lost classic ingredients. And I wanted to preface my actual remarks on fruit tonight with a meditation on why these restorations are important. And I'll do it thinking about one cultivar in particular. Shortly before the Civil War, a man named Nathaniel Napoleon Bradford took a very tasty watermelon from Georgia called the Lawson watermelon, which unfortunately was very unproductive and dumpy looking, but it tasted great, and crossed it with the Carolina long watermelon, which had the classic picnic 35, 40-pound oblong shape, absolutely green in its skin, and created the most superlative watermelon known in the 19th century, the Bradford watermelon. And this watermelon was generally recognized in South Carolina as the supreme watermelon. Its cousin, which was a cross between the Lawson and the mountain sweet watermelon, the rattlesnake watermelon, the one with the stripy skin, was Georgia's favorite watermelon. The Civil War destroyed the economic system in the South, and there was one intact railroad that snaked north out of Augusta, Georgia. And the people in 1866 were thinking how they could bootstrap themselves out of a condition of abject poverty, and they decided that they would load these watermelons onto rail cars and ship them north. Little did they realize that the sensation caused by tasting a Bradford watermelon in the Washington market in New York would be so great that it kick-started the entire truck farming industry in the South in the Reconstruction. But people in New York had never tasted a watermelon as good. Splendid, mineral, sweet. Unfortunately, there was a problem. When you stack Bradford watermelons more than 2 deep in a boxcar, it crushes the bottom watermelon. So you don't make profit by losing 40% of your watermelons en route. So the people around here thought, we've got to cross this watermelon with something which has the skin of a rhinoceros. They looked around, saw a watermelon called the scaly bark watermelon, and they crossed it to create a watermelon called the Kolbs Gem. Didn't taste as good as the Bradford watermelon, but hey, it's New Yorkers who are eating it, so who cares? We've got the Bradford in our backyard. But there's a problem with that thinking, and the problem is, where you get your treasure is where you put your focus, and more attention was paid to those Kolbs Gem watermelons until entire counties of Georgia and South Carolina were covered with these huge shipping melons. And when you create an entire landscape of one object, sooner or later the bug or pathogen that loves that thing more than anything else will show up, and it will find paradise. This happened in 1893 when Fusarium wilt showed up in southern Georgia, hit a Kolbs Gem field, and within one growing season wiped out half of the watermelon crop in the South. So watermelon growers who were depending on it for their livelihood, it was their cash crop, started shouting to the watermelon breeders, we need a watermelon that is disease resistant and shippable. By this time, taste has gone down to number 3 desideratum in the grand scheme of things, and you get the general story. But at the end of the 20th century, an interesting thing happened. And it may have been a reaction to fast food, the nationalization of food, who knows what. But out on the West Coast and down in the Gulf Coast, there was a turnaway. Alice Waters, out in Berkeley, California, said the vegetable is what we have to pay attention to, the taste of the vegetable, purity. And I guess people hadn't been tasting vegetables very much. You just chop them up, freeze them, and then defrost your Swanson TV dinner, and everything's okay. But, and down in the New Orleans, the Cajun culinary revival made regionalism a sort of interest. And people began realizing that something was amiss. And even here in Charleston, which prided itself on food, by 1993, there was a general realization that we were performing a charade. We had the recipes and Charleston receipts, but we didn't have the ingredients. Make a Hoppin' John with Carolina 10 black-eyed peas and Mahatma brand long white grain rice. You're missing the fundamental insight into what Low Country cooking was about. Hoppin' John Taylor and Glenn Roberts were two of the pioneers who said, we have to bring back the classic ingredients that made this a cuisine here, something that was recognized around the world for the quality of its food. The cuisine is always an expression of a growing system, a reflection of the entire scope of crops that are grown in a place. And Glenn Roberts, at the beginning of this century, came to me and said, you do research. We're trying to bring this back. We've lost so much, we don't know what we're bringing back. Could you help us? And so I spent 3 years reading ag journals, 19th century ag journals, reading old seed catalogs, nursery reports, spending day after day in the microfilm section of the Thomas Cooper Library at the University of South Carolina, or going to places looking at old plantation notebooks. So in 2006, I emerged from the microfilm bunker with a list, and I knew everything that had to be brought back. Glenn Roberts and I and several other people formed a foundation called the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation. And beginning in 2006, every year we brought back at least 3 of these ingredients. Until now, there are over 30. And immediately, they were embraced by the chefs throughout the South. Indeed, the lost Bradford watermelon we discovered in 2013. I had written a sort of lament that I had posted on the World Wide Web, and sort of tears falling down my face, The greatest tasting watermelon that the South has ever known is gone with the wind, And I got an email that was written at 2:30 in the morning, and I got it in the next morning. I wasn't up at that time. I'm growing a field of Bradford watermelons in Sumter, South Carolina. My name is Nat Bradford, the 8th generation descendant of Nathaniel Napoleon Bradford, the originator. So we went out to Nat Bradford's farm, and we saw the watermelon, we tasted it. And, sometimes you do taste the promised land. You taste something which is more complex, more sweet, more dulcet, more refined than any watermelon you'd ever tasted. And Lord knows, the situation with watermelons had become dire. We've got these little seedless refrigerator melons, little round ones that you stick in, chill down, cut open, no seeds. I mean, the seeds are half the fun, You remember, spitting seeds at your brother? That was that was half of the experience of a watermelon when you're a kid. You can't do it with these triploid melons that they sell. So we had a problem. We had a 40-pound seeded watermelon that we were trying to reintroduce to a market that was fixated on small, round, seedless melons. We knew that we weren't going to crash the grocery stores. But this is where we were smarter than anyone else in terms of thinking through these problems. If you have something that truly does have better taste than anything else, the historical record will always show that they tried to import that taste in all sorts of other sorts of preparations other than slices of fresh watermelon. So we revived some of the great old dishes. Watermelon molasses. Unbelievably wonderful. 16-to-1 reduction of the watermelon meat and juice, dark red. Use that to sweeten your iced tea. At the next lunch you serve, you'll have converts to your religion. Watermelon pickle. This particular watermelon had a 1-inch fork tender rind down to the skin, that white rind, the ideal pickling watermelon. April McGregor of Farmer's Daughters Pickles, the greatest pickler in the South up in Hillsborough, North Carolina, said, "Give me that melon. I've been trying to make watermelon pickles for years and the rinds are too thin." So watermelon pickle came back. And here in Charleston, High Wire Distillery revived watermelon brandy, which is really interesting. The first sip is sort of like fresh cucumber, and then it smooths out to that sweet watermelon, long finish on your tongue, sweet. You can't buy it now. Every bottle was sold out almost immediately. Anyone who heard it in the Spirits Underground bought it. 6 and 20 distillery up in upstate is now preparing it. And watermelon brandy has become a kind of secret fixture in the world of spirits in the South. So why bring back the flavors? Well, because it makes the world so much richer. It makes the taste so much more splendid. And this city, more than any other city, has benefited because the culinary explosion that's taken place in the last decade here is fueled by these splendid tasting ingredients that these chefs were the first to embrace. Now, chefs throughout the United States, indeed the world, import the grains, the vegetables that we prepare here. But what about the fruits? This is the last sort of area that we tackled. And one of the things that we realized when we did the research on fruits is that you can talk about locavorism all you want, you know, the notion of there being something that is particular to a place. But when you talk about fruits, that's the least locavore sort of stuff that is around. What is native in terms of American fruits? Nuts. Well, we have the chestnut, we have the hickory nut, we have the American persimmon. How many people have a persimmon tree around here? No? How many people have puckered their mouth on an unripe persimmon growing up? Yeah. At one juncture in the early 19th century, dried persimmons were the ideal, well, they were the most favored Christmas fruit for children to receive. You'd string them up, dry them out, and one of the lost foodways. The plums, the Chickasaw plums, very aromatic, very colorful, but so sour when you taste them raw in the field that you don't eat them fresh. You cook them down into plum jam and plum jelly. Now, the Chickasaw is interesting because most Chickasaw plums are cultivated these days in the nursery to serve as stocks for other Japanese, American, or European plums. But there is a group of people that likes to work with Chickasaws. The Mayhaw, growing around water sources throughout the Deep South. Mayhaw Jelly, there's a festival down in Mississippi devoted to Mayhaw Jelly. How many people have ever had a taste of Mayhaw Jelly? Yeah, that's good. Shad Bush, yeah, not one you're seeing in your produce section. The Pawpaw is undergoing a really interesting revival now, and numbers of people are growing it here in South Carolina. It grows more naturally deeper in the interior, but a custardy fruit. I've had an excellent product, which is pawpaw custard, sort of like lemon custard that you make in sour lemon cakes. I think that has legs. So the pawpaw is the biggest indigenous fruit from America, from North America, and is the one which most people are playing with. Then the wild black cherry, which is sour, but a great wine was made out of it. And if you know the right Gullah farmer, out on the Sea Islands, you can get some wild cherry wine that'll clarify your thoughts there. Now, there were certain plants that the English settlers thought were indigenous to the area, but were not. And one was the trifoliate or sour orange, which actually came over to St. Augustine in the early, 1540s probably. And the natives along the coast loved it and traded it up the coast so that wild oranges were encountered throughout the Low Country all the way up to Wilmington, North Carolina, when the Lord's proprietors settled Charlestown. And I actually ran across one of these, just walking through a suburb of Charleston the other year, and here's a photo of it. This is what it looks like in the wild. Good for marmalade, and the aromatics for the blossoms are the essence of orange water, which was one of the great flavoring agents for icings and puddings throughout the 19th century. Well, one of the things which is true is that there are certain foods which go across cultures readily and certain ones which inspire disgust. And of all foods, the one which is most permeable are the ones that we find here, the ingredients which made up the first world trade system. Tobacco, chocolate, coffee, wine, spirits, hot peppers, sugarcane, and spice. Now, all of these are drugs, but, they have a somatic effect, and they're mildly addictive. They're not nutritive in the sense that eating wheat or most grains are nutritive, but people sure did love them. And they sent them across Atlantic, Pacific, whatever. Now, we have to think of the introduction of fruit across the globe in light of the taste of sugar. Fructose, dextrose, sucrose, the elements of sugar found in various fruits, are concentrated in fruit. And this, by the way, is a very interesting book, The Taste of Paradise. And if you're interested in history and culture and trade, pick it up. It's a good one. Pomegranates. one of the very first fruits that were found to be really suitable to growing in Charleston. The importation of fruit was very catch as catch can in the 18th century. And people were bringing in peaches, they were bringing in apples, they were bringing anything that was familiar from their homes in France and England, and discovering that there were problems growing with it. And the problems are, I'll talk about some of them. And it isn't until 1830, when the Horticultural Society is founded here, that you get a systematic attempt to oversee the production of fruit. An award was given every year in an exhibition for the best fruit exhibited, and the cuttings from the fruit trees from that person would dominate the gardens of Charleston for the subsequent year. And I thought I'd list out the names of the winners for one of these years to indicate just what sorts of things were being brought in and who excelled at them. Henry Horbleck grew nectarines. Henry Stifley was the great cultivator of apricots. Charles Basseker grew peaches. Edward Decatus grew figs. Simon Magwood famously grew Secco and Brown Bear pears. William McCown bred apples. And the greatest floriculturist in the city, Jean Michel, grew 4 types of cherries, 20 French varieties of pears and prunes, limes, and 3 varieties of banana. In 1834, the Horticultural Society put up a wish list about things that it would like to see grown in the Low Country. And these included the pistachio nut, green tea camellia, the jujube, the stone pine, the camphor tree, hazelnut, the cherimoya, and the buffalo berry tree. How many of those made it? Does anyone know off their hand, top of their head? Camphor tree is all too frequent. It's now invasive throughout the South. Any pistachio trees around here that you know of? No? No, it doesn't do well here. But that camellia for tea, oh yeah, we've got the one place that it grows here in the mainland. So that was a good idea. Hazelnuts. Lucy and I went out to Oregon, to the Willamette Valley this summer, and saw a hazelnut grove. And they were wonderful, sort of magical plantings. And it made me recall this wish for the creation of hazelnuts here. And I don't know why we can't do it. We call them filberts, hazelnuts, whatever you want. They're wonderful nuts. And they don't have natural disease pests here because they've never been grown. So, looking for a project? Tired of growing your backyard oranges? Maybe a hazelnut tree, huh? But the problem is, it is extraordinarily difficult to transport a plant that grows in a completely different climate and soil situation with a different set of humidity and rain from one part of the globe to another. And many, many experimental plantings in the Low Country failed. The great project of bringing chocolate, cacao trees here, done in 3 years, 1827. Coffee, 2 years. Quinoa, grown here in the 1840s. Apparently weevils loved quinoa. So it was an extraordinary war with nature to bring your favorite old world sugary sweet and make it available locally. And I think there's one class of fruit which exemplifies the problem more than anyone else, and that's the grape. Now, you have to realize the English colonies, every colonial prospectus from the 17th century on, stated that it wished the colonies to grow wine grapes because its great rival, France, a Catholic power and enemy, was the great producer of wine, and the English had developed a taste for claret. And, the French bumped the price way up for their enemies, So if we can grow wine grapes in the colonies, we will bypass the price bump up. So, in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, cuttings from the noble Vitis vinifera vines of Europe were brought over, and invariably they would flourish 1 year, maybe 2 years, and expire in year 3 and 4. There were some plantings that were so extensive that there was a national vineyard outside of Philadelphia that was financed by the United States government in the 1790s. All the plants killed. Black rot, phylloxera, powdery mildew, white rootworm, Pierce's disease. I could go on reciting terrible grape diseases for a half hour, and you would get the challenge. The problem was that there were so many wild grape varieties here already growing in North America that when the Vikings came over, they called it Vinland. And each one of these things had its own mechanisms for killing off rivals and interlopers. And these pathogens are actually generated by the established grape varieties that had developed a resistance to them. So, when these Vitis vinifera, these innocent, noble vines came to North America, they were invariably wiped out. Until a man in South Carolina by the name of Nicholas Herbemont, a native of the Champagne, the first instructor of French at the College of South Carolina, succeeded in controlling all of these diseases by a variety of methods. Oh, he attempted what everyone else attempted. Indeed, he brought over 200 Vitis vinifera varieties to plant in his vineyards up in Columbia, South Carolina. Anyone been down Gervais Street in the center of the city? There's a block, Gervais, Bull, Pecans, and Lady Street. That was the first vineyard. All but 19 of these over 200 varieties expired. Those 19 weren't doing too well. So he crossed them with native resistant forms and began creating grape varieties that combined the resistance of the native plants to these diseases here and the tastes of Vitis vinifera. There were two in particular that became the grapes that the first American wine industry was based on. The Herbemont, that's the one on that side, this made rosé wine. The Lenoir, also called the Jaquez or black Spanish grape, which is the one on this side, made red wine. Both of them very important grapes in world history. When phylloxera invaded France in the 1860s and threatened to destroy the entire French wine industry, the Herbemont grape, which was grown extensively in Texas, Missouri, and South Carolina, were all uprooted and shipped to serve as a resistant rootstock on which were grafted the Vitis vinifera wines. Every estate in France exists to this day as a working entity because of that grape over there. And one of the things I've often wondered is why there is not a statue of Nicholas Herbemont erected somewhere in the state of South Carolina, the first man who is enabled to make wine here and the man who's indirectly responsible for saving the greatest wine industry that the world has seen. Another South Carolina grape, first discovered along the South Carolina-North Carolina border, was called the Catawba. And this made a white sparkling wine. The first wine millionaire in the United States, Nicholas Longworth, made the Ohio Valley from Cincinnati to Louisville the first sort of wine lands in the United States. And this was beloved. And one of the things we have to realize, we think that champagne has been around forever. In the early parts of the 19th century, champagne was a still drink for the most part, a still white wine. The bubbly only becomes popular in the 1830s in Europe, and in the 1840s begins to make inroads here in Charleston. It isn't until Nat Fuller, the great African-American chef in the 1850s, who serves it at various catered events, that it supplants Madeira as the preferred drink in Charleston. But this was a sparkling wine made exactly contemporaneously with the rise of champagne. It gave you the same tickle in the nose, the same sweet kiss on the lips, so this was our native champagne. And it existed as an industry all the way down to Prohibition. And it survives to this day, sparkling Catawba as a grape juice used in party punches for kids. Talked to a man named Justin Dean out in Cincinnati who wants to start, once again, the sparkling Catawba industry. Why not? Let's see what it tastes like. Another South Carolina grape called the Isabella became a world grape. It was planted in the Ukraine and Brazil, and it made a red wine that was a sort of vin ordinaire. Its robustness, productivity, and its disease resistance made it widely popular. But in the 1930s, the various nation states of Europe began outlawing American grapes as mongrel grapes. The 1930s in Europe were all about race purity or some genetic purity, so it got into the world of grapes. And every American grape, the Herbemont included, was outlawed from being grown to flowering. You could use the root stocks, but you couldn't let it produce grapes. But in Italy, they made this one wine out of it. It was a sparkling red wine that had the smell and taste of strawberries. And they called it Fragolino. And from 1930 on, there was an underground where this wine was grown. You knew what tavernas, what hotels produced it, and there's a little formula to ask for it. Even to this day, it's illegal, but it's the most beloved illegal wine in Europe. Why aren't we growing this in South Carolina where it came from, and it could be legal? We could have our own Fragolino. I've tasted a lot of bad strawberry wine in my day, but a grape wine that smells and tastes like strawberries, that makes Italians all fuzzy, why aren't we doing this? So, the Isabella grape. Mulberries. Nowadays, many people curse mulberries. They're the thing that ruined your mom's rug. They're the thing that gets trodden in from the street, causing the big purple stain that has to be cleaned on the floor. But at one time, the mulberry was considered, well, it was considered the economic savior of the South. There was this extraordinary fantasy that the silk industry would be raised up here. I mean, 1730s Savannah What was being grown on those squares? White mulberry bushes to feed silkworms. The white mulberry is there are two varieties. They come from China. We have a southern mulberry that's native. It grows inland in the forests, very robust, called the Mora rubris, the red mulberry. Birds love this mulberry, but for human consumption, it's not good. The man, Nicholas Herbemont, crossed the white mulberry with the red native mulberry and created a mulberry that dropped profusions of fruit for 4 months. It started fruiting in April and continued all the way to the 1st of August. Tremendous amount of fruit, which delighted chicken farmers and hog farmers no end. 48 of these trees at 40-foot spaced intervals could support 100 head of hogs in 1 acre for a third of a year. Chickens fed on mulberries. You've never tasted so sublime a treat as mulberry-fed chicken. The sweetness of the fruit making the chicken flesh so extraordinary. The early 20th century, both chicken and hog farmers became factory affairs. And the waste products of American mass agriculture were pelletized and used as feed. It wasn't until about 15 years ago, when the rise of the heritage breeds conservancies started bringing back the old chickens and the old hogs, that people began asking, why was the taste of these things so much better? Well, hogs were fed on mulberries for a third of the year, then peanuts and persimmons for a month, and then sweet potatoes all winter long. Think about that. Chickens. You would always have mulberry trees in the chicken yards. The Hicks mulberry, because of the way that agriculture went, got lost. It's still cultivated extensively in Australia and New Zealand, but the quarantine to get the things in here was so prohibitive that we started looking to find the last of the Hicks trees. And we found 9 of them outside of Mount Olive, North Carolina. That's one of them right there. These were planted in the 1850s. They look like wizard trees out of the Bavarian Black Forest. We took cuttings from them, and these cuttings are now being cultivated in Northern Virginia and by the Columbia Historical Foundation. So if you got some yard chickens, and I understand it's legal here in this city to grow, why not get yourself a little Hicks mulberry, and you'll be popular with every bird on the peninsula, you know? Anybody had mulberry wine? Mulberry jam? Yeah, mulberry wine was, a famous old Sea Island thing. It was a remedy. I mean, it was considered medicinal. So when we think about fruits around here, we think about peaches. Even though Georgia says it's the peach state, we all know that more peaches are grown in South Carolina than in Georgia. And the peach is particularly suited to culture in this state. And some of the greatest peach breeders came from either South Carolina or Georgia. This is the most heat tolerant of peaches. You know it as the Saturn peach. You sometimes see them, the flattened disc-like peaches that appear as a specialty item in the produce stand. But this could be grown down in the Florida Peninsula. It was introduced by P.J. Berkmans of Fruitlands in Augusta, Georgia, that nursery, which is now a famous golf course in Augusta. He introduced the Pinto peach, and now that the temperature gradient is moving northward and growing hot weather peaches is something that we have to worry about. we might start thinking in the Low Country of taking a look again at this peach, which was introduced in the 1860s from China. This is the peach that founded the city of Shanghai, the Shanghai honey clean peach. It was first introduced into America by Henry Lyons of Columbia, South Carolina. And its lusciousness, it was a yellow peach, was legendary. And from this peach, crossed with two English peaches that had been imported in the 18th century, you had the greatest white peach and the greatest yellow peach of the South. The Alberta peach was the yellow, bred by George Stumpf down in Marshallville, Georgia. For over a century, it was the classic market peach. And when we were up in the Northwest this summer, we found Alberta's being grown up there. So it has not expired at all as a market peach. Next to it, you see the Belle of Georgia. I love white peaches. I prefer them to yellow peaches, even though that's not the way the market goes. If you like peach brandy, this is your peach, and it is so luscious. It is so wonderful. It is so juicy. It is melting on the tongue, unctuous. I'm wearing out my taster vocabulary here, but what can I do? Now, I will say one thing. In the world of peaches, there are breeders nowadays who are not exclusively concerned with processability, shelf life, disease resistance, and transportability. There's a family out in Monterey, California, the Zager family. They run a company named Zager Genetics. They are the greatest peach breeders in the world. They do it the old-fashioned way, not by transgenic gene editing, but by pedigree breeding. And they have a white peach called the White Lady Peach, which is completely lacking acid. Do whatever you can to obtain it, you know? There's only so many hours we have on the planet. The pleasures are fleeting. The internet allows us extraordinary access toward ingredients. Get it. Get a tree. If you want to have the peach tree that makes everyone in the neighborhood come to your house, this is the one. Or if not, do the old Belle of Georgia if you want to play the heirloom thing. Now, I have my list of lost ingredients. And this peach, the Amelia Peach, which was first bred in Orangeburg in the 1840s, is one of them. A splendid light yellow peach that was deemed too tender to transport in boxcars. And that's why it went the way of all flesh. But when you read descriptions of people tasting it or baking this into tarts, it makes you want to have this peach virtually more than any other peach, except the Belle of Georgia. So, memorize this thing, scald it on your retina, be looking in people's backyards. Now, one of the things that I have to say is that if something is truly the best tasting of a category of ingredient that exists, there's somewhere, somebody, an old true believer who's rejected everything in the seed catalog ever since, who's keeping it alive. We found it with the Bradford Watermelon. We found it with the Carolina African Runner peanut, the ancestral peanut of the South, which we brought back this year. Somewhere, this thing is lurking. Bad news about pears. The Anjou pear, those buttery pears that came from France, when you grow them down here, there's a disease called fire blight that takes them out. And if you've grown pear trees, unless you're absolutely isolated and with a walled backyard and, a laser defense system, or, the blight will find it. So in Georgia in the 1840s, a man named Loquat crossed one of the bear pears from France with the hard sand pears from Asia and created the Loquat pear, which we know as a cooking pear. And this is a pear that grows in the backyards of many southern farms. It's popular. Anyone who made pear preserves, pear chutney, cooked down pears, pear butter, this was the pear they used. This is the signature pear of the Lowcountry. And it's never gone out of fashion since introduction because it's the only one that we can be assured of year after year of producing a crop that has the flavor of a pear. You can't eat it out of hand as a fresh fruit, even if you let it mellow in a dark room for a month. But cooked, it's wonderful. Does anyone have a sand pear? Okay. There is a lost pear here, which was a butter pear that apparently did thrive for a period of time, done by one of the greatest pomologists of the South, William Summer of Pomeria, South Carolina. This was called the Bachman pear. That Summer over there introduced many of the most important trees from the world into South Carolina, a great arborist and nurseryman, and a great breeder. This is a painting of the Bachman pear. Don't know where it is. Again, keep looking. Cherries. Cherries are a problem. John Michel grew 4 different varieties. And there are 3 general families or categories of cherries: the sours, the sweets, and what are called the dukes. And you know the sour cherries. They're the pie cherries, the preserved cherries. The Morello was a famous one. The Dye House was the Appalachian famous variety. And the Montmorency, which is the one that's now grown up in Michigan. And in sweet cherries, there are 2 varieties: the Black Tartarian, which is the ancestor of the Bing cherry, and the yellow Bijourou, or yellow Spanish cherry, which is the ancestor of the Rainier cherry. Those were the ones that we're familiar with. These were grown here, but it was never cold enough after 1825 when the climate shifted warmer. The Duke cherries are sweet sour cherries, and they were once extraordinarily popular and gone. The entire category, there are 6 or 7 varieties of them. I'm working with people in Appalachia now to restore their signature sour cherry, which was discovered in December of 2015. We did a most wanted poster and spread it across the mountains, and someone found 5 trees growing in Somerset, Kentucky. Maybe the Dukes, we can bring those back too. And one of the things I tell farmers is that no one has a bad opinion of cherries. They're the most universally revered fruit. I mean, there are even people that find peaches too messy. But cherries, no one hates cherries. Finally, apples. We think of apples as being one of the great heritages of English food culture, brought over and spread by legendary figures like Johnny Appleseed and things like that. The truth of the matter was there was only one indigenous fruit in the British Isles. It was the little purple sloe. Apples were introduced by the Romans late in the Roman period. They come from Kazakhstan originally. But they've spread around the world. They were originally grown at altitude, so growing them at the low country is always a challenge. But what happened was that when seedling groves existed, when you grew apples not by cuttings, which is the way we propagate now, but by planting seeds, you had a lot of different trees with different qualities appear. And sometimes a tree, thrived under conditions that you wouldn't normally think an apple would thrive in. There were two low country apples, both of them quite splendid. The Carolina Red June apple was a baking apple, and it was early season. It was the thing that you had in pies, cakes, and tarts, applesauce. The Hoover apple was your fresh eating apple. It was an autumn apple. And this is on the Slow Food Arc of Taste. There's a man in Johns Island, Greg Johnsman of Geechee Boy, who has planted an orchard of these. So if you want to taste the signature apple of the Low Country, it will soon be available through Geechee Boy Mills. And all power to him and to Glenn Roberts and the other people who do these restorations. The South is more active than any region in the repatriation of its classic apples, and there's a famous book, Old American Apples by Creighton Lee Calhoun, which catalogs them. And you'll notice that these illustrations that I've shown you tonight are beautiful watercolors of these cultivars. The USDA in the 1890s hired female artists to go out and paint the fruit of America. And one of the great public art legacies are the thousands of paintings that survive of American fruit. The apples alone number a little over 1,000. I want to talk about a Charleston favorite, the Loquat. Now, I don't know how many people know the location of all of the most publicly accessible Loquat trees in this city, but if you're a young boy or a young girl, I suspect that you know the locations of the ones near First Scots. And there's one up on Lambeau Street, and I've had my eye on those in a while. Originally, these were called the Japanese medlar, and they were imported in the 1830s into Philadelphia. And in 1837, Miss M. Smith on Broad Street planted the first one in the city. It is an evergreen and bears flowers of a delicate almond-like fragrance twice a year, but bears fruit but once a year. It has enjoyed its enduring place in the landscape for two reasons. One, it's a beautiful tree. Its foliage is splendid. Its configuration is admirable. And the other one is it's the first fruit that becomes ripe in the year cycle of fruit availability. So Loquat tarts and Loquat jam are part of the tradition of the city. Those Loquats that did not survive the onslaughts of little boys and birds found their ways into the kitchens and became the first of all treats. I want to talk about pecans, and I'm going to close here. We tend to think of pecans as part of the naturalized foodscape of our region. And you all know where the pecan trees are, who's got them, who you hit up in November to get the bag full of pecans, go out and collect them. This is entirely a 20th century thing. Pecans are indigenous to a very small region in Louisiana, Mississippi, and East Texas. And a method of propagating them only existed since the Civil War, and commercial nurseries only handled them since the 1880s. The first pecans that were brought into the Low Country were this variety, the Stewart pecan. So if you're looking at the oldest pecan trees that you know of in the city, if you've been out to Charlestown Landing and seen the big pecans out there, Those are pecans that were done in the 1890s of this variety. Now we consider them natural, part of the, I don't know. It isn't the low country without pecan trees, but the squirrels of the low country know, Paradise did not come until around 1900. And when it came with a vengeance. I've been looking for one pecan in particular called the Rome. This was a pecan that grew that big. Instead of 40 to 50 making up a pound, 25. Unfortunately, it had very irregular harvests. One good year, 2 or 3 bad years, a modest year, or another good year, and it suffered from kernel shrinkage. So bigger is not necessarily better. And it finally got rejected by pecan farmers because it wasn't reliable enough as an income thing. But my thinking is now, we've got control over genetics. What we need is the size dimension of that, and we'll just work on the productivity by crossing it with other pecans. So if you see a real big pecan tree, call me up. University of South Carolina. I talk about the project of reviving all of these ingredients in a book that was published in 2015 called Southern Provisions. It talks about the rise of low-country cooking, its fall, and its rebirth. Available at booksellers near you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for an excellent lecture, probably the most delicious that we've had all year. I know it's dinner time, but if there are any questions out there.
Figs. Figs began being propagated. Charleston had a huge appetite for figs, and the grocery stores in Charleston would, by the crate load, import dried out turkey figs through the 1850s. And gradually, kind of fig culture gets built up around the world, around the Civil War. White figs, the Austria fig, the brown turkey fig, but there's a problem with propagating figs. It needs a wasp. So you can't breed figs the way they breed naturally in Turkey. The process, caprification, can only take place in one place in North America, and it's a small area in California where they've got these wasps growing. So, what you get is little fig plants that are imported or done from cuttings, and all the figs that we have are from those importations in the mid-19th century. Now, in parts of Spanish Florida and Texas, there are 16th century figs which you can get cuttings from. If you want to get a cutting that predates Jamestown, I know Bill Kelso was here last month, talking about Jamestown. Bill Kelso was someone I worked for in 1972 as a field excavator in Carter's Grove Plantation in Williamsburg. So Bill was a very young man, and I was once. So pre-Jamestown figs.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, David.